Okay, are we alright? Oh, so it films from there. I'm really nervous now. Okay, so today we're going to talk about zombies. First thing you need to know about zombies is that there is a crucial distinction between Hollywood zombies and philosophical zombies. And it's the latter that we're going to be interested in. So Hollywood zombies, as we all know, look like this, and this, and this. Whereas philosophical zombies look like this, this, this. This is what I got. Google imaging ordinary people. So a philosophical zombie, as opposed to Hollywood zombie, looks just like an ordinary human being. And they walk and talk and behave in all ways just like Abby. Come on. A philosophical zombie looks like and behaves and walks and talks just like an ordinary human being. And the reason they behave just like an ordinary human being is that the physical workings of their body and brain are identical to those of an ordinary human being. But there's a crucial difference. A philosophical zombie has no consciousness, no feelings or experiences. There's nothing that it's like to be a philosophical zombie. So you stick a knife in a philosophical zombie, they scream and try and get away, but they don't actually feel pain. Or if a zombie is crossing the road, they look both ways and wait until the traffic's calmed down and carefully cross the road, but they don't actually have any visual or auditory experience of the situation around them. So here's the definition. A philosophical zombie is by definition a physical duplicate of a human being, but which has no conscious feelings or experiences. Okay. Second thing you need to know about zombies is that they don't exist, right? That nobody, not even your craziest philosopher, thinks that zombies are actually real. The philosophical interest, at least in the first instance, is that they seem to be conceivable. Okay, so what do we mean by conceivable? Here's the definition of conceivability. Something is conceivable if and only if we can't rule out its existence just through reasoning. Okay, so here's an example. So contrast flying pigs and square circles. Neither of these things exist, but flying pigs have a slight advantage over square circles in that they're at least conceivable. There's no contradiction or incoherence in the notion of a flying pig. And hence you can't know just sat in your armchair through thinking that there are no flying pigs. You have to go out and look at the world to find out that there are no flying pigs. Square circles, in contrast, not only do they not exist, but the very idea of a square circle is just incoherent, right? And because of that, you can know just sitting in your armchair thinking that there are no square circles, right? You can know, you don't have to go out and look at the world. You can know from your armchair that throughout the whole of space and time, there are no square circles. What do we think about it? So this is what we mean by conceivability. Flying pigs, arguably conceivable. Square circles are inconceivable. I think actually conceivability is, I don't really like the word because it sort of suggests something to do with imagination. Whereas I think what we're really interested in is something more like logical coherence. We're interested in what can or can't be ruled out through reason. But anyway, we're stuck with that term. So this is the first thing we're interested in with zombies. Are they more like flying pigs or square circles? So some philosophers think they're more like flying pigs. They don't actually exist, but, there's nothing contradictory about the idea. Whereas some people think they're more like square circles. Just the very notion of a philosophical zombie, physically identical to a human being, but no consciousness, is just incoherent. Okay, so that's the first thing, but why is that interesting? It seemed like a kind of rather abstract, silly philosophical question to be worrying about. The interest in thinking about conceivability is that many philosophers, not all, but many philosophers, think that if something's conceivable, that shows that it's possible, in the sense that there could have really been such a thing if the universe had been very different. So taking square circles and flying pigs again, flying pigs are conceivable. Many philosophers say, well, that shows that there could have been flying pigs if the universe had been very different, if the law of gravity had been weaker, maybe, or if pigs had evolved with wings, there could have been flying pigs. Whereas square circles, because not only aren't there such things, but because the notion is incoherent, there couldn't possibly be square circles. No matter how different the universe might have turned out, no matter how weird and wacky, it couldn't have contained square circles. So this is a principle that many, not all, philosophers sign up to, which we can call the conceivability principle. The principle that if something's conceivable, then it's possible. So this is the interest in zombies. Nobody thinks they're real, but they seem to be conceivable. And if zombies are conceivable, perhaps that gives us reason to think that they're possible, that there really could have been such things walking the earth if the universe had turned out very differently. Okay, you still might think, well, why? So what? All sorts of things are possible. Why should we care about what's possible? Surely we should be interested in the real world, actuality rather than mere possibility. But, and this is, I guess, where it gets really interesting, there's an almost universal consensus among philosophers, not quite universal, but almost universal, which is quite impressive for philosophers, that the mere possibility of zombies, not their actuality, the mere possibility is inconsistent with physicalism. Right? So physicalism, we spent last week discussing exactly what physicalism is and found out it's less straightforward than you might think. But let's, for the moment, just work with the kind of rough and ready definition. The physicalism is the view that everything that exists is physical. And the mind is the brain. Consciousness is a neurophysiological, electrochemical process in the brain. And many people, very, very popular view, many philosophers like this view, because I guess they think it brings consciousness into the domain of science, right? Because neurophysiological processes are kind of thing that are studied and known about through neuroscience. So if we can identify consciousness with neurophysiological processes in the brain, then we've brought it into the domain of science. We've, as it were, put consciousness under the microscope. There's nothing then magical or mystical about consciousness. And we looked also last week, David Papineau's argument that there is strong, he thinks there's strong scientific support for physicalism. So, if it turns out that, well, as almost all philosophers agree, that the mere possibility, not the actuality, the mere possibility of zombies is inconsistent with physicalism, then that is very interesting because it opens up the possibility of ruling out a very popular, perhaps scientifically supported theory of reality just through armchair reasoning. Okay, so why do people think that zombies, the mere possibility of zombies is inconsistent with physicalism? So let's just start with a very simple definition, simple form of physicalism, and then we can broaden it out as we go on. So a simple form of physicalism is the identity theory. So this is the view that conscious states, that is to say feelings and experiences, are identical with neurophysiological states of the brain. So, for example, the feeling of pain might be identical with C fibers firing, where C fibers firing is supposed to be a kind of neurophysiological state of the brain that it might be scientifically plausible to identify with pain. As it turns out, C fibers firing is not an empirically plausible candidate to be identical with pain. But for the sake of discussion, we just take C fibers firing to stand in for some kind of brain state that it might turn out through scientific investigation that it's plausible to say to identify with the feeling of pain. So on the identity theory, pain and C fibers firing are just one and the same thing seen from, as it were, two different perspectives. So just as you might see this building from the front, then you might go around and see the building from the back. You're looking at the same building from two perspectives. Similarly, according to the identity theory, the feeling of pain, that very feeling you know about when you feel it, is one and the same thing as a brain state that the scientists can see in your head and can prod and poke. That's just one and the same thing, sort of known about in two different ways. Okay, that's the identity theory. Here's a principle that many philosophers find very attractive, which I'm going to call the identity principle. This is the principle that if X is identical with Y, then X couldn't possibly exist without Y. Okay, so why would you think that's plausible? So let's take a concrete example. Does anyone know who this is? No. You're going to kick yourselves. Charles Dodgson. Who's Charles Dodgson? No? Also known as Lewis Carroll. Interesting. Learn interesting facts in this class. Okay, so Lewis Carroll is also known as Charles Dodgson, a logician, and Lewis Carroll's his pen name. Okay, so what we've got here is just one person with two labels, right? One person that is both Charles Dodgson and Lewis Carroll. So Charles Dodgson is identical with Lewis Carroll. It's just one and the same person. So it seems to follow, and this is what the identity principle states, that Lewis Carroll and Charles Dodgson couldn't possibly exist separately because they're just the same person. There aren't two people, Lewis Carroll on the one hand and Charles Dodgson on the other, that you could separate. You couldn't have Charles Dodgson in one room and Lewis Carroll on the other because they're just the same person. There's just one person with two names. So not even an all-powerful being could rip apart Lewis Carroll from Charles Dodgson, right? So that's what the identity principle states. Seems pretty plausible, if X is identical with Y, like Lewis Carroll is identical with Charles Dodgson, they couldn't possibly exist apart because there's just one thing. Okay, that's the identity principle. So now let's think about that in the context of the identity theory. So let's take this sample thesis that the feeling of pain is identical with C fibers firing, the kind of thing the identity theory would want to state. C fibers firing wouldn't be a plausible example, but some brain state, C fibers firing standing in for some brain state that the identity theory is going to want to identify with pain. So let's call that the identity thesis. The feeling of pain is identical with C fibers firing. Now if we bring in the identity principle, if X is identical with Y, then X couldn't possibly exist without Y, it follows, logically, that C fibers firing couldn't possibly exist without pain, just as Lewis Carroll couldn't possibly exist without Charles Dodgson. Because we don't have two states, C fibers firing on the one hand and pain on the other, that are different. There's just one state that is both C fibers firing and pain, one state with two names, as it were, two ways of knowing about it. And yet, a zombie has C fibers firing, but no pain, right? That's by definition a zombie. It has C fibers firing in its brain. You stick a knife in it, C fibers fire in its brain, causes it to scream and run away, but it doesn't actually feel pain. Or whatever brain state you want to identify pain, the same is going to apply. Therefore, the possibility of zombies, the mere possibility, is inconsistent with this identity thesis that pain is identical with C fibers firing. And that's going to apply exactly the same form of argument is going to apply whatever brain state is proposed to be identical with pain. Because zombies, by definition, have all exactly the same physical nature as a human being, so they have all our brain states, but they have no consciousness, they feel no pain. So the mere possibility of zombies rules out the identity theory. Popular, simple way of construing physicalism. Okay, so this is the kind of... Let's have some tea. So this is the idea that how the zombie argument goes. There are sort of three stages. Starts off with a claim about conceivability. Zombies are conceivable. You can't rule them out just through reasoning, through thinking. Then a move to possibility. Well, if zombies are conceivable, then that shows that they're possible, that there could have been such things. Like there could have been flying pigs if the universe had been very different. They're not real, but they're possible. And then finally, there's a move to the falsity of physicalism. If zombies are possible, then physicalism is false. And that final move is actually the least controversial. Almost everyone agrees with that. So some people tend to think, well, that must be the most controversial. How can you go from possibility to a fact about the real world? But it's just sort of the way almost everyone agrees that physicalism is defined. It follows that the mere possibility of zombies is inconsistent with physicalism. Okay. So just to put it in a formal argument, we go like this. Premise 1, zombies are conceivable. Then we bring in the conceivability principle. If something's conceivable, then it's possible. Then we can infer logically from that conclusion 1, therefore zombies are possible. Premise 3, if zombies are possible, then physicalism is false. Therefore, we can infer logically to conclusion 2, physicalism is false. Okay, so it's a very interesting argument. You might think it's a kind of silly idea at first, but because it offers the possibility of ruling out a very popular, perhaps scientifically supported theory of the world. So that's basically the argument. I just want to finish... what's happened there? Okay, finish with the following. So, you might think that some kind of trick has been played on you here. So you might have the reaction, you might think, well, this is a very clever argument. Babi is nodding. You might think, this is a very clever argument, and I can't immediately see what's wrong with it, but there must be something wrong with it. And that's because, you can't rule out a scientifically supported theory of reality just through some philosophical argument that you dream up sat in your armchair. We should look to science rather than armchair speculation to tell us what reality is like. So I think that's a common and quite understandable reaction. But I'd just like to say, I think there are at least two things one could say in response to this. First response, it's worth remembering or knowing that Galileo actually refuted Aristotle with a mere philosophical argument. So for thousands of years, people followed Aristotle in believing that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. Seems kind of common sense that heavier objects will fall faster. Galileo proved that to be false, but he didn't prove it to be false as popular myth reports by standing on the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropping a feather and a lead ball. He didn't need to. Rather, he proved that it was false with a pure philosophical argument in his armchair. Maybe not in an armchair. Maybe he was walking. I don't know. But he demonstrated that Aristotle's view involved a contradiction. So we're not going to go into this now, but that shows the potential, at least, for a purely philosophical kind of logical argument to overturn scientific consensus. I think we should think of Galileo not just as one of the greatest scientists that ever lived, but as one of the greatest philosophers, in this sense, that he has the perfect philosophical argument, which had a very strong conclusion about physical reality. But a more fundamental point, I don't think we should... Excuse me. I don't think we should think of the zombie argument actually as a purely sort of logical argument. I think there is a source of data which is implicitly being appealed to in the argument, namely our awareness of the reality of consciousness. Because if you think that if you're happy to say consciousness doesn't exist, as Keith Frankish is happy to say, we're gonna look at in a couple of weeks, then this zombie argument is no problem, because you can just say, sure, zombies are possible. We're all zombies, right? None of us have consciousness, and that's Daniel Dennett has been known to say that in some moods. It's only if you think that consciousness exists, you start from that assumption that consciousness exists and must be accounted for, that the zombie argument starts to be a challenge, because it tries to show that physicalism cannot account for the reality of consciousness. Now, I've suggested in previous classes that there is a sense in which the reality of consciousness is a non-empirical datum, in the sense that we don't know consciousness exists through observation or experiment. If you look in someone's head, you're not going to see their feelings and experiences. There is no experiment that can prove the reality of consciousness. We know that consciousness exists just by being conscious and by our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences and sensations. And we thereby know that there is a reality that must be accounted for, the reality of consciousness. And therefore, if there's a theory of reality that can account for all the data of observation and experiment, but can't account for the reality of consciousness, that reality that we're all immediately aware of, then that theory must be false. So the point is, I'm not saying it's that there's no way of attacking the zombie argument, but I think we should not dismiss it too quickly, because I don't think it really is a sort of purely logical argument that's trying to conjure up sort of a priori conclusions about reality in the way, for example, the ontological argument for the existence of God tries to do. I think we should see the argument as starting from data, from the reality of our feelings and experiences. And it tries to show that physicalism just can't account for that data, and so must be false. So I think that's the way we should see the argument. Okay. That's the idea. What do you think?